Hello, I am glad you are here. Tonight, we will take a gentle journey back in time to a Europe that was at once mysterious, fearful, and haunted by shadows that flickered in the imagination of its people. Our story is a calm one, meant to guide you softly into the history of witch hunts, as if the past were whispering to you across centuries. Let us settle into this quiet exploration together, letting the rhythm of history carry us gently as we move through centuries of belief, fear, and human experience. Long ago, in the late Middle Ages, Europe was a continent of villages and towns surrounded by dense forests and misty hills. People lived close to the rhythms of nature, and their lives were shaped by the cycles of planting and harvest, by the movements of the sun and the moon. Disease and sudden death were constant companions, and the unknown loomed at every corner, often cloaked in superstition and wonder. It was in this world that the first whispers of witchcraft began to stir, faint murmurs that a few individuals might possess powers beyond the ordinary, powers that could heal or harm. In those early centuries, the concept of a witch was not yet the fearsome image that would come to dominate Europe later. Witches were sometimes seen as cunning women or men, folk healers, wise in herbs and remedies, able to aid their neighbors. Communities might call upon them for help when a child fell ill, when livestock grew weak, or when crops failed. Yet, alongside this respect for their knowledge, there was also a seed of suspicion. If a healer's remedies failed, if misfortune struck, eyes might turn toward that healer with unease. In the medieval imagination, misfortune could be the result of hidden, malevolent forces, and the question of who might control such forces began to take root in the minds of ordinary people. By the 14th century, Europe was changing in ways that would give rise to a new and more terrifying idea of witches. The Black Death had swept across the continent, leaving devastation in its wake. Entire villages were emptied of life, and survivors were left with grief and confusion. People searched desperately for reasons, for explanations, for someone or something to blame. It was in these desperate times that accusations of witchcraft began to appear more frequently, as communities sought to make sense of suffering that seemed beyond human control. A neighbor's sudden death, a string of failed harvests, the illness of a child, all could be interpreted as signs of a hidden hand at work. Religious influence, too, shaped the growing fear of witches. The Catholic Church, which dominated spiritual life in much of Europe, emphasized the struggle between God and the devil, between the forces of good and evil. Sermons often spoke of the devil's ability to tempt humans, to sow chaos and sin. It was an age in which the supernatural was ever present in the minds of believers, and the line between divine justice and diabolic interference was thin and uncertain. By the 15th century, church authorities began to issue formal condemnations of witchcraft, describing it not as a harmless superstition, but as an actual pact with evil itself, a direct threat to the community and to the soul. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, would crystallize this fear into a manual of suspicion. Written by two inquisitors, it detailed how witches might seduce the innocent, cause storms, blight crops, or poison their neighbors, and how they could be identified and prosecuted. It was a chilling text, methodical and persuasive, and it spread widely throughout Europe, providing both religious and legal justification for the persecution of suspected witches. As the 16th century dawned, Europe became increasingly fragmented by religious upheaval. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation stirred political and theological conflict, creating an atmosphere in which fear could thrive. Communities were anxious not only about the devil's presence in the world, but also about the betrayal of faith among their neighbors. In this charged climate, accusations of witchcraft multiplied. People were arrested, interrogated, and often forced to confess under extreme pressure. The methods of interrogation were brutal, designed to break the human spirit and extract admission of guilt, even when none existed. Witch hunts were not uniform across Europe. In some regions, like parts of Italy and Spain, they were relatively restrained, while in areas such as Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, the hunts could be extraordinarily intense, consuming entire towns in a wave of fear and suspicion. Trials were conducted both in secular courts and under ecclesiastical authority, and punishments ranged from fines and public penance to imprisonment and death. Often, the accusations arose from local quarrels, envy, or personal grievances, but the legal and religious machinery gave these personal disputes a deadly seriousness. By the 17th century, the image of the witch as a servant of the devil had become deeply ingrained in European culture. Children were warned against strangers, neighbors watched one another with suspicion, and ordinary misfortune could spark horrifying consequences. The accused were often women, though men were also implicated. The reasons for targeting women were complex. Women were traditionally associated with domestic knowledge and healing, yet also seen as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation, making them convenient scapegoats for communities desperate to explain misfortune. Communities became arenas of paranoia. Neighbors whispered about strange behavior, about who might have cursed their animals or caused illness. Confessions, often extracted under torture, created a self-reinforcing cycle. The accused would implicate others to escape their own suffering, spreading terror through the town and beyond. Records from this time describe entire families destroyed, villages scared by executions, and an atmosphere in which the normal bonds of trust between neighbors were fractured by fear. Even as the hunts escalated, some voices questioned their validity. Skeptics argued that confessions obtained under torture were unreliable, that the evidence of witches was often circumstantial or imagined. Yet these voices were often drowned out by the hysteria, by the need to assert moral and religious authority, and by the simple human desire for a clear explanation for misfortune. The result was decades of terror, a Europe in which the shadow of suspicion stretched over countless lives. The story of the European witch hunts is long and complicated, but it is also one of human psychology, belief, and social pressure. It is a story of how fear can spread, how communities can turn on themselves, and how the unknown can be made terrifying by imagination and authority. As the 17th century waned, the intensity of the hunts gradually began to decline. Legal reforms, growing skepticism, and changing cultural attitudes reduced the number of trials, though fear of witches lingered for many years. As the 17th century advanced, Europe continued to grapple with the complex mixture of religion, law, and superstition that had fueled the witch hunts of earlier decades. In many regions, the mechanisms of persecution had become highly organized. Local authorities, often with guidance from central courts or religious institutions, maintained records of accusations, interrogations, and executions. Towns and villages kept detailed registers, sometimes noting the names of those accused, their alleged crimes, and the outcomes of their trials. These records revealed patterns that were common across Europe. Women, particularly those who were elderly, widowed, or socially marginal, were most often accused. Yet men, especially those who occupied positions of authority or who were otherwise seen as a threat, could also find themselves accused. The reasons for accusations were rarely simple. Disputes over land or property, rivalry between neighbors, jealousy, or the desire to explain a sudden misfortune could all play a role. For example, if a farmer's cattle died unexpectedly, or if a sudden storm ruined a harvest, suspicion could fall on someone who had been previously involved in a quarrel, or who held unusual knowledge of herbs and remedies. The mechanisms of accusation were structured in such a way that one accusation often led to another. Under pressure from authorities, the accused might name others, creating a chain reaction of arrests and interrogations. Legal procedures varied across regions, but many shared common elements. A person suspected of witchcraft would be detained and questioned. Interrogations often involved intimidation or physical coercion, though the use of formal torture varied depending on local laws and customs. Confessions extracted under such pressure were treated as definitive evidence, and witnesses were sometimes called to corroborate the accusations. Courts would deliberate, sometimes for months, before reaching a decision. Punishments ranged from fines or public humiliation to imprisonment and execution, often by burning, hanging, or beheading, depending on local law. Germany became one of the most affected regions during this period. The Holy Roman Empire was composed of many semi-independent territories, each with its own legal system and local authority. Some areas experienced extreme outbreaks of witch hunts, with hundreds of people accused and executed over the course of several years. The intensity of the hunts was often linked to social stress, war, disease, or economic hardship. In some towns, the fear of witches became a constant presence, shaping daily life and interactions. Citizens would monitor one another for signs of deviance or unusual behavior, and accusations could spread quickly, sometimes reaching the attention of higher courts. Switzerland experienced similar episodes of intense persecution. In the small cantons, accusations of witchcraft could engulf entire communities. The accused were often marginalized individuals, widows, healers, or those without strong social support. But the broader population also participated in the trials through testimony or by spreading rumor. The authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, reinforced the belief that witches were agents of the devil, capable of harming anyone, anywhere. Records from the Swiss cantons describe detailed examinations of alleged magical objects, such as charms or potions, and the application of ritualistic quiz questioning to uncover pacts with the devil. Scotland, too, saw significant witch hunts, particularly in the early 17th century. The Scottish legal system, influenced by Protestant theology, emphasized the sinfulness of witchcraft and its connection to the devil. Trials often focused on confessions obtained through questioning, and accusations were sometimes based on the testimony of children or neighbors. The social context was important periods of political instability. Poor harvests or outbreaks of disease often coincided with waves of accusations. Scottish records show that both men and women were accused, but women made up the majority of those tried and executed. The punishments were severe, and public executions were intended as both justice and warning. In England, the situation was somewhat different. Witchcraft legislation had existed since the late 15th century, but the intensity of persecution fluctuated. During the reign of James I, a heightened fear of witches developed. James himself had a strong interest in witchcraft and even wrote a treatise on the subject, which encouraged rigorous investigation and prosecution. The English legal system relied heavily on the testimony of witnesses and the evidence presented in court, rather than widespread use of torture. Nevertheless, accusations could spread quickly, and hundreds of people were executed for witchcraft in England over the 17th century. The infamous trials in Pendle and East Anglia are examples of how local disputes and fear could escalate into deadly accusations. France experienced witch hunts that varied by region. In the northeast, along the borders with Germany and Switzerland, the intensity of trials was often higher, influenced by both local traditions and continental trends. Rural communities were particularly affected, as small villages faced economic stress, poor harvests, and the lingering memory of earlier epidemics. Accusations were sometimes directed toward individuals who were socially vulnerable, and trials could involve detailed questioning, examination of supposed magical objects, and testimony from neighbors. The punishments ranged from imprisonment to execution, with burning being the most common method in areas influenced by continental practice. The Netherlands, in contrast, experienced relatively fewer executions, although accusations and trials did occur. The legal and social structures in Dutch towns often limited the intensity of the hunts, and skepticism about evidence and confessions helped to prevent large-scale persecution. Similarly, in Scandinavian countries, while witch trials were conducted, the scale and intensity varied widely. Sweden and Denmark, for example, saw periods of concentrated trials in the early 17th century, but overall fewer people were executed than in Germany or Switzerland. Social and religious factors, including the influence of Lutheran or Calvinist teachings, played a role in shaping both the fear of witchcraft and the procedures for prosecution. Throughout Europe, the witch hunts left profound marks on society. Families were destroyed, communities were traumatized, and suspicion lingered long after trials ended. The mechanisms of fear and accusation created an environment in which ordinary life was overshadowed by the possibility of supernatural harm. Economic pressures, religious belief, political instability, and social tensions all contributed to the spread of witch hunts, demonstrating how interconnected human societies are with the beliefs they hold. By the late 17th century, a gradual shift began to occur. Legal reforms, increased skepticism among intellectuals, and changes in cultural attitudes slowly reduced the frequency and severity of witch hunts. The rise of scientific thinking and the Enlightenment encouraged critical examination of claims about supernatural powers. Scholars and authorities began to question the validity of confessions obtained under torture and the reliability of evidence based on rumor or superstition. Central authorities in many regions took a more cautious approach to prosecutions, limiting the ability of local courts to pursue accusations without careful oversight. Despite this decline, fear of witches did not disappear entirely. Folklore, rumors, and isolated trials continued into the 18th century, particularly in rural areas where traditional beliefs remained strong. However, the scale of persecution had diminished significantly. Communities that had once been engulfed in hysteria now began to focus on practical concerns, such as economic recovery, governance, and social stability. The memory of past hunts persisted, shaping literature, art, and local customs, and serving as a reminder of the consequences of fear and suspicion. When combined with social and religious authority, the history of European witch hunts, spanning roughly from the 15th to the 18th centuries, represents a complex interplay of culture, law, religion, and psychology. It demonstrates how communities respond to uncertainty, how belief in supernatural forces can influence social behavior, and how legal and religious structures can magnify the effects of fear. While the most violent phase of the hunts ended by the 18th century, the stories, records, and testimonies from these periods remain a window into the lives of ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Europe's experience with witch hunts also offers lessons about human behavior under stress. Fear can spread rapidly, and when combined with authority, ritual, and tradition, it can lead to collective actions with devastating consequences. The accused were often vulnerable individuals, targeted because of age, gender, social status, or personal disputes. Their stories remind us that persecution often follows patterns that are as much about social dynamics as they are about belief in the supernatural. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that witch hunts were not just about witches or magic. They were about human attempts to make sense of a world filled with uncertainty, disease, and sudden misfortune. Communities sought explanations, and when ordinary causes were insufficient, supernatural explanations filled the void. This pattern, repeated across centuries, left a profound mark on European culture, shaping law, social norms, and collective memory. As the 18th century progressed, the witch hunts that had once gripped Europe with terror had become less frequent, yet the memory of them remained vivid in many communities. In parts of Germany, Switzerland, and France, the records of trials continued to exist, though prosecutions were increasingly limited to isolated cases. The legal frameworks that had once facilitated mass accusations were gradually reformed. Courts required more rigorous evidence. Confessions under torture were increasingly questioned, and central authorities often intervened to prevent excessive local zeal. Yet despite these reforms, the cultural memory of witchcraft lingered in folklore, storytelling, and local superstition. In Germany, certain regions continued to see accusations into the early 18th century. Small towns with dense forests and remote valleys were particularly prone to outbreaks of fear, partly because isolation made rumors more powerful and verification more difficult. The process of accusation often began with a simple rumor: a child falls ill, a cow dies suddenly, a storm destroys a farmer's wheat. Suspicion turns to a neighbor who has been known to possess knowledge of herbs or remedies. In many cases, the accused were elderly women, widows, or individuals who lacked strong social connections, making them easy targets. The interrogations could be lengthy and psychologically intense, with questions designed to elicit confessions of pacts with the devil, attendance at Sabbaths, or use of magical objects to harm others. Swiss records from this period show that the intensity of hunts was variable, dependent largely on local magistrates. In some cantons, a single accusation could spiral into multiple arrests, fueled by testimony that accused others under threat of punishment. Unlike in earlier centuries, however, there was a growing emphasis on documenting evidence rather than relying solely on confession. Investigators began to require witnesses who could provide corroboration of suspicious acts, though such witnesses were often themselves influenced by fear and superstition. Some Swiss communities developed informal safeguards, attempting to separate genuine criminal behavior from imagined witchcraft, which indicates the gradual rationalization of the judicial process. In France, the late 17th and early 18th centuries saw a significant decline in mass trials, but accusations did persist. Rural areas, particularly in regions with less direct oversight from central authorities, continued to produce cases. A farmer's sudden misfortune, a string of illnesses, or the failure of livestock could provoke investigation into a suspected witch. Unlike the mass hysteria of previous decades, these later trials were often localized, involving small numbers of individuals. Authorities increasingly relied on legal documentation, and local officials were required to seek confirmation before carrying out any severe punishment. Nonetheless, some trials still resulted in execution, usually by burning, though such instances were increasingly rare. England and Scotland followed a similar trajectory, with prosecutions becoming less frequent but still present. In Scotland, the last recorded executions for witchcraft occurred in the early 18th century. English courts, influenced by Enlightenment thinking, were gradually more skeptical of evidence derived from fear or superstition. Magistrates began to demand more tangible proof, and confessions extracted under duress were often deemed inadmissible. Despite these changes, belief in witches persisted among the general population. Folk practices, charms, and superstitions remained part of daily life, particularly in rural communities where literacy and formal education were limited. The methods of accusation and trial during these later periods illustrate both continuity and change. While fear and rumor continued to motivate accusations, there was an increasing emphasis on legal procedure and rational investigation. Interrogations still occurred, but the use of torture declined significantly. Courts demanded clearer evidence, and central authorities often monitored local proceedings to prevent excesses. This shift was partly due to changing intellectual attitudes. Philosophers, scientists, and legal scholars questioned the validity of witchcraft accusations, promoting skepticism about supernatural explanations for natural events. Regional differences remained pronounced. In Scandinavia, for example, Norway and Denmark experienced periods of concentrated trials, particularly in the 17th century, but by the early 18th century, prosecutions had largely ceased. Local courts continued to hear accusations of sorcery or magical harm, but the sentences were often milder, including fines, public penance, or short imprisonment rather than execution. Similarly, in the Netherlands and parts of Italy, witch trials became increasingly rare, and by the mid-18th century, Most regions had largely abandoned formal persecution. The cultural and social legacy of the witch hunts extended beyond the legal sphere. Stories of witches, their supposed pacts with the devil, and their magical powers were recorded in local folklore, literature, and art. Tales were passed from generation to generation, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes modified, but always retaining the memory of fear and suspicion. Even as legal authorities moved away from persecution, ordinary people continued to discuss witches, charms, and curses in private conversation. The stories served as moral lessons, cautioning against envy, greed, or straying from accepted social norms. Despite the decline of formal persecution, the psychological impact on communities was long-lasting. Entire families had been destroyed, social bonds disrupted, and trust among neighbors weakened. The social mechanisms that had allowed mass accusations to spread, fear, rumor, personal vendettas, and belief in supernatural causation, left a mark on collective memory. Communities learned to navigate a landscape in which suspicion could have deadly consequences, shaping both legal reforms and social behaviors in the centuries that followed. Scholars studying these later periods note that the decline of witch hunts coincided with broader intellectual, economic, and political transformations. The spread of literacy, increased communication between regions, and the influence of rationalist philosophy all contributed to a reduction in fear-driven prosecutions. Centralized governments and stronger legal frameworks allowed for greater oversight, ensuring that accusations could not escalate into mass hysteria without scrutiny. Scientific explanations for disease, crop failure, and natural disasters gradually replaced supernatural interpretations, further reducing the perceived threat of witchcraft. Even as prosecutions declined, the memory of the hunts persisted in the collective imagination. Court records, local chronicles, and personal diaries documented the experiences of the accused, their families, and the communities in which they lived. These sources provide a vivid account of daily life under the shadow of suspicion, neighbors watching one another, children learning fear of the unknown, towns planning rituals or investigations to prevent harm. The detailed accounts serve as historical evidence of the mechanisms of fear and as a reminder of the human cost of superstition. When combined with legal and religious authority, the end of large-scale witch hunts in Europe did not eliminate belief in witches entirely. Folk traditions continued to describe people with magical abilities, charms to protect against curses, and remedies to counteract ill fortune. In rural areas, old practices persisted, blending superstition with practical knowledge of herbs and remedies. People continued to speak of witches in whispers, to avoid offending those they suspected, and to consult local wise women or men for protection. The transition from persecution to folklore reflects a broader cultural shift, from fear-driven enforcement to imaginative storytelling and practical caution. In examining the historical arc of European witch hunts, it is clear that they were a product of multiple factors: religious doctrine, legal authority, social tension, economic stress, and human psychology. The pattern repeated in diverse regions across centuries, though the intensity, methods, and consequences varied widely. Mass hysteria could emerge when conditions were right: periods of instability, widespread disease, economic hardship, and pervasive religious belief. Communities, motivated by fear and the desire for order, turned suspicion into accusation, and accusation into prosecution. By the late 18th century, the European witch hunts were largely concluded. Most regions had abolished legal provisions for prosecuting witches, and intellectual currents increasingly rejected supernatural explanations for misfortune. Enlightenment thinking encouraged reason and evidence, reshaping legal procedures and societal attitudes. Nevertheless, the legacy of the hunts endured, influencing folklore, literature, and social memory. Communities that had once been torn apart by fear learned to navigate a new understanding of justice and social responsibility. Yet the stories of the accused, the methods of prosecution, and the consequences of mass fear remained embedded in European history. The witch hunts of Europe, spanning roughly 4 centuries, illustrate the dangers of unchecked fear, the influence of authority on social behavior, and the ways in which human communities respond to uncertainty. They were not merely about belief in the supernatural, but about the interaction of law, religion, social norms, and human psychology. Through examining these events, we gain insight into the mechanisms by which societies can generate and perpetuate fear, and the ways in which reason and reform can eventually counteract those forces. Even today, the memory of these events continues to resonate. Museums, archives, and scholarly research preserve records of trials, confessions, and executions. Local traditions and storytelling maintain awareness of the past, ensuring that the experiences of those accused are not forgotten. The history of witch hunts reminds us that fear can be both personal and communal, that superstition can become a tool for social control, and that justice requires vigilance, reason, and empathy. By the middle of the 18th century, the age of the European witch hunts was drawing to a close, though the memory of terror remained vivid in many rural communities. In the forests of Germany, in the remote valleys of Switzerland, and in small villages across France and Scandinavia, old fears still lingered, passed quietly from parent to child. Tales of witches, their supposed Sabbaths, and their powers to harm continued to circulate even as the courts no longer carried out mass executions. The fear that had once dominated daily life was gradually replaced by curiosity, skepticism, and a sense that the unknown could often be explained by natural causes. Legal reform played a crucial role in this transition. Courts across Europe began to adopt stricter evidentiary standards, reflecting the growing influence of rationalist thought and Enlightenment philosophy. In Germany, centralized authorities insisted that accusations of witchcraft could not be acted upon without credible testimony and corroboration. Torture, once a common tool of interrogation, was increasingly restricted or prohibited. Judges demanded documentation and scrutiny, making arbitrary prosecutions far more difficult. These changes did not immediately erase fear, but they reduced the likelihood that rumor alone could lead to execution. Switzerland offers a clear example of the slow decline of prosecutions. In the early 18th century, a few isolated trials still occurred, but they were small in scale, often involving a single individual accused of causing illness or crop failure through magical means. Authorities required evidence beyond rumor, and the accused were sometimes released if no proof could be found. This cautious approach reflected a broader cultural shift. Communities were learning to separate superstition from legal action. The influence of science, medicine, and critical thinking encouraged a more measured response to misfortune. France experienced a similar transformation. In the Northeast, where earlier witch hunts had been severe, trials in the 18th century were rare and heavily regulated. Legal authorities increasingly sought to distinguish between superstition and criminal activity, avoiding extreme punishments. Confessions obtained under pressure were often disregarded, and the courts demanded witnesses who could provide verifiable evidence. By the mid-century, most cases involved fines, public penance, or short-term imprisonment rather than execution. The courts, increasingly under the influence of Enlightenment ideas, emphasized rational investigation over fear-driven prosecution. In England and Scotland, the decline was equally evident. The last significant trials occurred in the early 18th century, after which formal prosecution for witchcraft largely disappeared. English courts relied more on evidence and witnesses, and the use of torture was effectively eliminated. The population, however, continued to hold beliefs in witchcraft, charms, and the supernatural, particularly in rural areas. Folk practices and cautionary tales persisted, serving as cultural remnants of earlier fear rather than instruments of legal persecution. Scotland's experience followed a similar pattern. Legal authorities became skeptical, but the memory of past trials remained, shaping local stories, and moral lessons. The decline of witch hunts was not uniform across Europe, and some regions experienced lingering fear longer than others. In Scandinavia, isolated accusations continued into the early 18th century. In Norway, for instance, a few individuals were tried and punished for alleged magical practices, though executions were rare. In Denmark, prosecutions were increasingly symbolic, serving as warnings rather than acts of extreme punishment. The persistence of belief in witches in these regions reflects the long-standing cultural connection between superstition, rural life, and local authority. Even as formal persecution declined, the cultural and social impact of the hunts was profound. Communities had experienced decades, and in some cases centuries, of fear-driven accusation and execution. Trust among neighbors had been eroded. Ordinary disputes could escalate into legal proceedings with lethal consequences. Entire families had been destroyed, leaving gaps in the social fabric. These consequences lingered long after the courts ceased formal prosecution. Villages and towns carried the memory of past terror in their oral histories, folklore, and local traditions. Even as the practical threat of execution vanished, the psychological imprint of suspicion and caution remained. One of the most notable effects of the decline was the transformation of superstition into folklore. Once feared, witches became subjects of storytelling, morality tales, and cautionary legends. Children were warned about witches not as a matter of law, but as a cultural lesson in behavior, morality, and vigilance. Communities retained awareness of supernatural possibilities, but the response was largely symbolic rather than punitive. Folk medicine and herbal knowledge continued to be practiced, often framed as practical remedies rather than magical intervention, further illustrating the transition from fear-driven action to cultural memory. In examining this transition, it becomes clear that the European witch hunts were deeply connected to social, economic, and psychological conditions. In times of uncertainty, whether caused by poor harvests, disease, war, or political upheaval, fear of witchcraft surged. Accusations were often motivated by personal grievances, envy, or disputes, but were magnified by religious and legal authority. The individuals most frequently accused, elderly women, widows, and socially marginalized people, reflected the intersection of vulnerability and suspicion. Communities projected their anxieties onto those who were already isolated, creating a pattern repeated across regions and centuries. As the 18th century progressed, intellectual and cultural changes contributed to the ultimate decline of witch hunts. The spread of literacy, education, and scientific understanding challenged beliefs in supernatural causation. Physicians, natural philosophers, and legal scholars began to explain illness, crop failure, and other misfortunes through observable, natural causes. Centralized governments increasingly oversaw local courts, ensuring that accusations could not escalate into mass hysteria without oversight. Legal reforms prohibited torture or demanded higher standards of evidence. Together, these changes transformed Europe from a continent of fear-driven persecution to one in which rational investigation gradually replaced superstition in the judicial system. Despite these improvements, the shadow of the hunts remained. People continued to discuss witches, charms, and curses, often privately. Communities retained awareness of the social consequences of fear. Accusations could still harm reputations, create conflict, and generate tension, even when the law no longer sanctioned execution. Oral history preserved the memory of those who had suffered, ensuring that the lessons of the past about suspicion, fear, and the consequences of collective hysteria were not forgotten. Notable trials during the final decades of persecution reveal how slowly practices changed. In Germany, isolated cases involved accusations of harm to livestock or illness of a neighbor, often connected to older women with herbal knowledge. Authorities investigated with care, seeking corroborating evidence and limiting the use of coercion. In France, cases were similarly rare, and sentences were more lenient, often involving minor penalties rather than execution. In England, Records show that magistrates required witnesses and factual evidence, reflecting the growing influence of rational legal procedures. These cases illustrate both continuity and change. Accusations persisted, but fear no longer dictated extreme punishment. The transformation of European society during this period highlights the broader theme of human adaptation to fear and uncertainty. Witch hunts demonstrate how social structures, religious authority, and cultural belief can converge to produce collective action, often with devastating consequences. At the same time, the decline of prosecutions illustrates the capacity of societies to adapt, to apply reason, and to reform systems that previously amplified fear. The long memory of witch hunts reminds us that cultural practices, even when no longer legally sanctioned, continue to influence behavior, perceptions, and social norms. In some regions, the memory of persecution became an explicit lesson in governance and justice. Courts and central authorities documented past trials, noting the injustices committed, the role of rumor and superstition, and the consequences of unchecked fear. By the late 18th century, these records were used to justify legal reforms and promote rational administration of justice. Intellectuals and philosophers analyzed the historical patterns, seeking to understand how societies could prevent similar episodes of mass hysteria in the future. These reflections helped shape the legal and cultural frameworks that underlie modern European justice systems. Even as legal and social reforms curtailed prosecution, belief in witchcraft remained part of daily life in subtle ways. People continued to carry charms, seek advice from herbalists, and interpret unusual events in light of supernatural possibilities. Communities relied on traditional knowledge, not out of fear of legal action, but as a precaution, a cultural habit, or a personal moral practice. In this sense, the shadow of witch hunts did not vanish completely. It transformed into folklore, custom, and memory, guiding behavior and shaping social expectations without the threat of formal punishment. By observing this gradual shift, it becomes clear that the European witch hunts were both a product of their time and a demonstration of how societies respond to uncertainty. Legal, religious, and social mechanisms amplified fear, targeting the vulnerable and transforming rumor into deadly action. Over centuries, intellectual, legal, and cultural developments reduced the capacity for such persecution, but the stories, memories, and lessons persisted. European communities learned to balance belief with reason, fear with law, and suspicion with oversight. The legacy of witch hunts continues to be relevant in understanding human behavior under stress. The combination of social pressure, authority, and cultural belief can produce outcomes that harm individuals and communities, particularly when fear outweighs evidence. The European experience serves as both a historical record and a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of allowing fear to dominate judgment. By examining these patterns, modern societies gain insight into the dynamics of accusation, persecution, and social control, as well as the mechanisms that prevent such outcomes from recurring. By the later decades of the 18th century, witch hunts had largely ceased as a widespread legal phenomenon, yet isolated cases continued to appear in several European regions. These instances reveal both the persistence of old fears and the changing approach of authorities in the face of Enlightenment thinking and rationalist influence. In Germany, for example, a few small towns still encountered accusations, usually involving elderly women who were blamed for illnesses in children or mysterious deaths of livestock. Unlike the large-scale hunts of the 17th century, these prosecutions were generally limited to a handful of individuals, and authorities increasingly emphasized evidence and documentation. Confessions obtained under coercion were often challenged, and judges were expected to weigh the testimony of neighbors against observable facts. Switzerland, which had once witnessed intense outbreaks of witch hysteria in the 17th century, also experienced sporadic trials in the early 18th century. The process by then was more methodical, constrained by law and by a growing recognition that false accusations had caused unjust deaths in the past. Communities sometimes brought suspected witches to court based on rumor, yet judges demanded verification through witnesses and evidence. While some accused were still punished, the sentences were frequently minor, such as fines, public penance, or short imprisonment. Burning or execution, common in earlier centuries, had become exceptional. The decline reflects both legal reform and cultural change, as communities gradually learned to separate fear from judicial action. France similarly saw the slow fading of witch trials. In rural regions where superstition remained strong, accusations occasionally emerged, often connected to illness or crop failure. In some cases, disputes between neighbors escalated into accusations of magical harm. However, the legal system, influenced by the central monarchy and Enlightenment ideals, increasingly required concrete evidence and scrutiny. Courts were careful to distinguish between superstition, moral transgression, and actual criminal acts. Execution for witchcraft became rare, and by the mid-18th century, most punishments involved temporary confinement or fines. The emphasis shifted toward rational judgment and caution, rather than fear-driven persecution. In England and Scotland, the legal decline of witch hunts was more pronounced. English courts required tangible evidence, and confessions obtained under duress were no longer admissible. This shift reflected both cultural change and the influence of intellectual critique. Philosophers and scholars questioned the plausibility of supernatural causation, promoting rational explanations for misfortune and disease. Scotland's experience mirrored England's, though folk belief persisted longer in rural communities. Even without legal prosecution, suspicion remained, influencing social behavior and local customs. People continued to speak in hushed tones of witches and magical harm, using these stories to explain minor misfortunes and to enforce social norms, particularly in small, isolated communities. Scandinavia presents an interesting case in the final decades of European witch hunts. Norway and Denmark had previously conducted intensive trials, particularly in the 17th century, but by the 18th century, prosecutions were sporadic and generally symbolic. Individuals might still be accused of causing illness or misfortune through magical means, but the courts increasingly emphasized mediation, reconciliation, and cautionary fines rather than execution. The persistence of belief in witchcraft in these regions illustrates the long-lasting influence of cultural tradition and folklore. Even when formal punishment was no longer socially or legally sanctioned, Italy experienced a comparable trajectory. In northern regions influenced by Germanic and Swiss practices, accusations occasionally surfaced, particularly in rural areas where superstition remained strong. However, the legal system, under the oversight of the Catholic Church and central authorities, emphasized evidence and moderation. Trials were more cautious and punitive measures were generally mild. In the southern regions, where folk belief was prevalent, accusations were often handled privately, with local authorities resolving disputes without resorting to execution. The pattern highlights a broader European trend. Witch hunts had moved from widespread, fear-driven persecution to isolated cases governed by reason and oversight. The social consequences of centuries of witch hunts remained profound. Communities had experienced repeated episodes of fear, accusation, and violence. Families were broken apart, and social bonds eroded under the pressure of suspicion. Entire villages had been scarred by hysteria, leaving a lasting imprint on collective memory. These consequences persisted even after the legal system reduced prosecutions. Fear continued to influence behavior, shaping interactions, social hierarchies, and the ways in which communities interpreted misfortune. The psychological imprint of witch hunts endured long after executions had ceased, leaving Europe with a legacy of caution, suspicion, and moral storytelling. One of the most significant cultural transformations was the conversion of fear into folklore. Stories of witches, their supposed Sabbaths, and their magical powers were preserved in oral traditions, literature, and local chronicles. These narratives shifted in tone. Once instruments of terror, they became cautionary tales, moral lessons, and sources of cultural identity. Children were warned not necessarily out of fear of legal punishment, but to instill social norms and caution. Herbal knowledge, charms, and protective rituals persisted, framed as practical or symbolic measures rather than instruments of legal enforcement. This transformation illustrates how societies adapt, turning collective trauma into cultural memory and storytelling. Notable late trials illustrate the transitional nature of this period. In Germany, cases in the early 18th century often involved accusations of harm to children or livestock. Courts demanded evidence beyond rumor, scrutinizing testimonies and evaluating the credibility of claims. Punishments, when imposed, were often limited to fines, public penance, or short-term imprisonment. Similarly, in Switzerland, isolated prosecutions persisted, but legal oversight prevented widespread hysteria. In England, Scotland, and France, the courts demonstrated growing skepticism of supernatural claims, reflecting a combination of Enlightenment thought, legal reform, and evolving cultural attitudes. The decline of witch hunts also coincided with broader intellectual and societal transformations. Scientific discovery, medical advancement, and philosophical critique challenged the notion that misfortune was the result of supernatural interference. Disease, crop failure, and natural disasters could now be explained without invoking witchcraft. Legal reforms reflected these changes, limiting the authority of local courts to act on rumor alone and restricting punitive measures. Central governments monitored local jurisdictions, ensuring that accusations could not escalate into large-scale persecution without oversight. This combination of intellectual, cultural, and legal change ultimately ended the era of mass witch hunts in Europe. Even as formal persecution ended, belief in witches persisted in subtle ways. Folk practices, charms, and oral traditions continued to influence daily life, particularly in rural communities. People relied on practical knowledge of herbs, protective rituals, and community-based methods of prevention. Witches, once feared agents of the devil, became figures of folklore, cautionary tales, or objects of curiosity. Communities retained awareness of the social consequences of suspicion, even when the legal system no longer sanctioned execution. In this sense, the memory of witch hunts shaped behavior, morality, and social norms long after the courts ceased to punish. The European experience demonstrates the interplay of fear, authority, and culture. Witch hunts were fueled by social, economic, and psychological pressures, amplified by legal and religious structures. Communities projected anxieties onto vulnerable individuals, creating a pattern that repeated across centuries. Yet the eventual decline illustrates the capacity of societies to adapt rational thought. Centralized oversight and cultural evolution reduced fear-driven violence. The memory of witch hunts persisted as folklore, moral instruction, and historical record, preserving lessons about human behavior under uncertainty. By the end of the 18th century, witch hunts were no longer a widespread legal practice, but their influence remained embedded in European culture. Court records, local chronicles, and oral traditions documented the mechanisms of accusation, the methods of prosecution, and the consequences for individuals and communities. These records provide historians with detailed insights into daily life under fear, the dynamics of suspicion, and the social structures that enabled persecution. They also serve as cautionary examples of how fear, when amplified by authority and superstition, can disrupt society and destroy lives. The long-term social impact of witch hunts was subtle but significant. Communities had experienced repeated episodes of mistrust, accusation, and punishment, leaving a mark on social norms and relationships. Stories of witches and their supposed powers became embedded in cultural memory, shaping moral expectations and behavioral norms. Folk traditions, charms, and protective rituals persisted even as formal prosecution ceased, demonstrating how deeply social practices can survive beyond legal enforcement. In examining individual cases from the late 18th century, historians observe patterns that echo earlier periods. Accusations were often motivated by personal disputes, economic tension, or fear of illness or misfortune. The accused were usually socially vulnerable individuals, particularly elderly women or those with limited support networks. Courts required evidence and witnesses, reflecting a rationalized approach to justice. Punishments were limited and rarely fatal. These cases illustrate a transitional period. Fear remained, belief in supernatural causation persisted, but society was increasingly constrained by reason, oversight, and evolving legal principles. The memory of witch hunts also played a role in shaping modern European legal and social consciousness. Scholars, reformers, and authorities reflected on past mistakes, emphasizing the importance of evidence, fair trial, and the protection of the vulnerable. Legal reforms in the 18th and 19th centuries codified principles that prevented arbitrary persecution based on superstition or rumor. This historical awareness contributed to the broader Enlightenment project of rational governance, human rights, and social reform. Even as the practical threat of witchcraft diminished, cultural memory remained. Folktales, literature, and art preserved the stories of accused witches, capturing the fear, mystery, and moral lessons of the past. Oral traditions transmitted cautionary lessons from one generation to the next, keeping awareness alive without invoking legal action. Communities remembered both the terror of past prosecutions and the importance of moderation, skepticism, and evidence in judging the actions of others. In this context, the European witch hunts serve as both historical record and moral lesson. They reveal the mechanisms by which fear can escalate into collective action, the role of authority in amplifying or restraining persecution, and the social consequences of unchecked suspicion. They also demonstrate how societies can evolve, reducing fear-driven violence through legal reform, rational inquiry, and cultural adaptation. The legacy of witch hunts is therefore both cautionary and instructive, illustrating the human capacity for both destruction and reflection. As the 18th century progressed toward its later decades, the presence of witch trials in Europe became increasingly rare. By the mid-1700s, most countries had officially ceased to execute those accused of sorcery, though isolated prosecutions persisted, often in remote or rural regions. These final episodes illustrate both continuity and change, marking the slow transition from fear-driven justice to rational, evidence-based legal practices. In regions such as Germany, the Swiss cantons, and parts of France, accusations often stemmed from traditional explanations for illness, crop failure, or livestock death. Communities clung to old beliefs that misfortune might be caused by unseen forces, and when misfortune occurred suddenly, a nearby individual, often elderly or socially isolated, became the target of suspicion. Germany, which had experienced some of the most intense witch hunts during the 17th century, continued to see sporadic trials into the early 18th century. By this time, the nature of prosecutions had shifted significantly. Authorities were more cautious, demanding credible testimony and attempting to verify claims rather than acting purely on rumor. In many cases, those accused were subjected to careful questioning without the use of torture. When punishment occurred, it often consisted of fines, public confession, or temporary confinement. Execution became increasingly uncommon, reflecting both legal reform and evolving attitudes towards supernatural belief. In Switzerland, the situation mirrored Germany's experience. The intense witch hunts of the previous century had left deep scars on communities, and by the 18th century, judicial authorities sought to avoid repeating those errors. Investigations into accusations required corroboration, and magistrates often relied on medical or practical explanations for misfortune. In some cases, disputes over property, inheritance, or personal grievances fueled allegations, but the courts increasingly required evidence before imposing significant penalties. Local officials also became more sensitive to the social impact of accusations, understanding that false charges could divide communities and undermine social cohesion. France similarly saw a decline in prosecution, but retained isolated instances of accusation. Rural areas, particularly in regions less directly influenced by central authority, experienced cases in which individuals were blamed for causing illness or natural misfortune through supposed magical practices. Legal authorities, however, applied a stricter standard of proof. Confessions obtained through coercion were increasingly rejected, and witnesses were scrutinized for reliability. Punishments were generally moderate, reflecting a growing skepticism of supernatural causation and an emphasis on rational judicial procedure. In England and Scotland, formal trials had become rare by the mid-18th century, though belief in witches and folk magic remained part of rural culture. The legal system had evolved to demand tangible evidence, making large-scale persecution almost impossible. In rural communities, people still recounted stories of witches, charms, and curses, often as explanations for misfortune rather than legal claims. In Scotland, small pockets of rural suspicion persisted, but prosecutions were typically symbolic, involving fines or public penance rather than corporal punishment. England's experience was similar, with local magistrates exercising caution and central authorities maintaining oversight to prevent mass hysteria. The persistence of belief alongside declining legal enforcement reveals an important aspect of European society during this period. Superstition did not vanish overnight. Even when authorities no longer sanctioned executions, communities continued to interpret unusual events in supernatural terms. Folk medicine, charms, protective rituals, and oral storytelling remained integral to social life, serving as ways to manage uncertainty and maintain moral norms. Witches transitioned from feared agents of harm to figures of folklore, cautionary tales, or cultural symbols. The memory of past persecutions informed this transformation, serving as a cautionary backdrop for social behavior. By the late 18th century, the majority of European societies had established legal frameworks that effectively prevented witch hunts from escalating into large-scale persecution. Central governments and judicial authorities monitored local courts to ensure that accusations were evidence-based and that punishments were proportionate. Enlightenment thinking, emphasizing reason, observation, and human rights, encouraged skepticism towards supernatural claims and influenced both law and social attitudes. This intellectual shift, combined with evolving legal structures, marked a decisive departure from the fear-driven practices of previous centuries. Despite these changes, isolated cases continued to appear in remote regions. In the rural valleys of Germany, for instance, accusations sometimes involved elderly women who were blamed for causing illness in children or livestock misfortune. Local authorities investigated with care, often seeking witnesses who could provide corroboration. Punishments, when imposed, were modest, typically consisting of fines or short-term detention. In Switzerland and parts of France, similar cases persisted, often linked to long-standing folk beliefs or disputes between neighbors. These final episodes highlight the slow, uneven nature of the decline in witch trials. Fear persisted culturally even as legal enforcement diminished. Scandinavia also experienced a tapering of witch prosecutions during this period. In Norway and Denmark, occasional trials occurred into the early 18th century, though they were isolated and usually symbolic rather than fatal. Accusations often arose from local disputes or unexplained misfortune, but the courts prioritized reconciliation, evidence, and moderation. Execution became nearly non-existent. This gradual reduction in severity reflects both social evolution and legal reform, illustrating how long-standing cultural fears could persist while formal authority restrained violent outcomes. Italy presents an interesting variation in the final stages of European witch persecution. In northern regions influenced by Germanic and Swiss practices, occasional accusations emerged, particularly in rural areas. However, judicial authorities were increasingly cautious. Punishments rarely involved death, instead focusing on fines, restitution, or public confession. Southern Italy, with its stronger emphasis on local custom, resolved disputes over alleged magic largely through community mediation rather than formal prosecution. The persistence of folk belief in both regions demonstrates the cultural depth of supernatural explanations, even as the legal system had moved toward rationality and restraint. The cultural consequences of centuries of witch hunts were profound. Communities had been shaped by fear, accusation, and social tension. Families were fractured, social bonds were strained, and the memory of persecution influenced interactions and social norms long after formal prosecutions ended. Communities retained stories of accused witches, cautionary tales, and moral lessons, preserving knowledge of past events without the threat of execution. Folk practices, charms, and protective rituals remained embedded in local culture, demonstrating the persistence of belief even as formal enforcement disappeared. The transformation from legal persecution to cultural memory illustrates how societies adapt to past trauma. Witch hunts had created patterns of suspicion, accusation, and social tension. Over time, legal reforms, intellectual developments, and cultural adaptation allowed communities to maintain moral and social cohesion while mitigating fear-driven violence. Folk traditions, storytelling, and local rituals preserved the memory of the hunts while converting fear into narrative and social lesson. This process of adaptation demonstrates the capacity of societies to process historical trauma, creating continuity while minimizing harm. Individual cases from the late 18th century reveal the mechanisms of this transition. In Germany, some towns still prosecuted alleged witches for causing illness or livestock death. Courts demanded detailed testimony and verification, often consulting multiple witnesses. Punishments, when applied, were minor and rarely involved corporal or capital penalty. In Switzerland, similar cases illustrate cautious judicial oversight, with authorities evaluating evidence carefully and avoiding excessive measures. In France, England, and Scotland, prosecutions were rare, reflecting both intellectual and legal reforms. These late trials exemplify the gradual decline in the severity and frequency of witch-related prosecutions, marking the end of a centuries-long phenomenon. The broader social implications of this period are significant. Communities had learned, through experience, the dangers of unverified accusation and the human cost of collective fear. Folk memory and cautionary tales served as reminders of past injustice, promoting social moderation and reinforcing norms without resorting to legal coercion. The legacy of the hunts influenced social attitudes, emphasizing the importance of reason, evidence, and fairness in communal life. By the 19th century, the legal and social structures of Europe had fully moved away from witch trials. Centralized authority, Enlightenment thought, and scientific understanding ensured that accusations could no longer escalate into lethal action. Folk belief in supernatural harm persisted in cultural form, but the mechanisms of persecution had disappeared. Communities relied on observation, practical knowledge, and rational explanation rather than fear of witchcraft. Folk tales, literature, and local history preserved the memory of the hunts, providing moral lessons and cultural continuity without threatening life. In reflecting on the European experience, several patterns emerge. Fear, superstition, and social pressure created conditions for widespread persecution. Legal and religious authority often amplified these pressures, producing deadly outcomes for vulnerable individuals. Over time, intellectual, legal, and cultural developments constrained the capacity for such violence. The transition from mass execution to rationalized justice and folklore demonstrates both the destructive potential of collective fear and the human ability to adapt, reform, and preserve cultural memory responsibly. Even after the cessation of prosecutions, the shadow of witch hunts continued to influence European culture. Oral traditions, written chronicles, and folk stories maintained awareness of the past, reinforcing social norms and cautioning against suspicion and malice. Communities retained the memory of the destructive potential of fear, even as reason and law limited its expression. The European witch hunts thus offer a dual lessons, a historical account of persecution and a demonstration of social adaptation in the face of fear. By studying the patterns of accusation, prosecution, and eventual decline, historians gain insight into the mechanisms by which societies respond to uncertainty, misfortune, and social tension. Witch hunts were not simply a matter of superstition, they reflected complex interactions between law, religion, culture, and human psychology. Their decline highlights the capacity of institutions, thought, and social norms to limit violence and protect vulnerable populations. The enduring memory of these events illustrates the long-lasting influence of fear and belief on human communities, even after legal authority has shifted. By the final decades of the 18th century, witch trials across Europe had become an infrequent legal phenomenon, yet belief in witchcraft persisted in various forms. While courts and central authorities increasingly relied on reason and evidence, communities in rural and isolated regions continued to attribute misfortune to supernatural interference. These lingering beliefs often manifested as accusations of poisoning, illness, or harm to livestock. In some cases, disputes over property, inheritance, or personal grievances provided the catalyst for formal charges, demonstrating that while supernatural fear had declined in its lethal intensity, it remained intertwined with social tension. Germany, which had endured some of the most extensive witch hunts of earlier centuries, experienced sporadic cases into the mid and late 18th century. Even in the relatively rationalized legal environment of the time, older women, often widows or those living on the margins of society, remained vulnerable to accusation. Courts required witnesses, documentary proof, or clear signs of guilt before issuing sentences. Confessions obtained under coercion were increasingly inadmissible, reflecting a broader shift toward fairness in judicial procedure. Punishments were generally limited to fines, public penance, or temporary confinement. The decline of executions demonstrated the gradual institutionalization of reason over fear, although suspicion remained a persistent feature of daily life. Switzerland provides a clear example of the delicate balance between cultural memory and legal enforcement. The intense witch persecutions of the 17th century had left a deep imprint on communities, and by the 18th century, magistrates were cautious in handling accusations. Trials were now constrained by legal oversight, requiring substantial evidence before any punishment could be imposed. Isolated accusations often involved alleged harm to children or livestock, but courts typically imposed mild penalties or resolved disputes through mediation. The persistence of belief in witchcraft within folk culture illustrates the tension between cultural tradition and institutional rationality. The legal system prevented mass persecution, yet stories, rituals, and superstition continued to shape social behavior. France experienced a similar evolution. In rural regions distant from central authorities, accusations occasionally arose, particularly when unexplained illness, sudden death, or failed crops were linked to individuals perceived as socially marginal. Legal authorities applied increasingly strict standards, evaluating testimony, corroborating evidence, and social context before issuing sentences. Confessions obtained under duress were often rejected, and the use of corporal or capital punishment became increasingly rare. By the late 18th century, prosecutions that reached court were more symbolic than punitive, designed to resolve local tensions rather than to punish supernatural activity. England and Scotland experienced a decline in formal prosecution earlier than many continental regions, but folk belief remained strong, particularly in isolated rural communities. Accusations of witchcraft persisted as social warnings or explanations for misfortune, rather than as legal charges with lethal consequences. English courts required tangible evidence, and Scottish courts were similarly skeptical of supernatural claims. While legal enforcement had largely ended, communities continued to navigate suspicion through oral tradition, cautionary storytelling, and informal local intervention. Folk knowledge, charms, and remedies were common, reflecting continuity of belief, even as the risk of formal prosecution vanished. Scandinavia demonstrates another facet of the late decline. Norway and Denmark had conducted intensive trials during the 17th century, but by the 18th century, prosecutions were infrequent and mostly symbolic. Allegations still arose from unexplained misfortune or disputes between neighbors, but authorities relied on mediation, fines, or short-term confinement rather than execution. Execution had effectively disappeared as a judicial tool, and local magistrates emphasized resolution over punishment. The persistence of belief in supernatural causation, however, reveals how cultural memory could endure long after institutional fear had dissipated. Italy, too, provides evidence of this transitional period. In northern regions influenced by Germanic and Swiss practices, occasional accusations appeared, often linked to folk medicine or local disputes. Judicial authorities applied caution, emphasizing evidence and moderation. Punishments rarely involved death, and settlements often focused on restitution or minor penalties. Southern Italy, where folk tradition was deeply embedded, resolved alleged magical offenses primarily through mediation and community negotiation, rather than formal prosecution. This divergence between northern and southern Italy illustrates the influence of local culture, governance, and intellectual currents on the handling of supernatural accusations. The consequences of centuries of witch hunts extended far beyond the cessation of prosecutions. Communities had endured cycles of fear, accusation, and punishment, which left lasting social and psychological effects. Families of the accused were often stigmatized, trust among neighbors was undermined, and communal relationships were reshaped by suspicion. Even as courts imposed rational oversight, social memory of the hunts persisted, shaping oral tradition, moral instruction, and communal behavior. People continued to exercise caution, both practically and socially, informed by historical awareness of the dangers of rumor and accusation. The transformation from fear to folklore illustrates a critical process in European cultural adaptation. Tales of witches, magical harm, and protective charms evolved from instruments of terror into narrative forms that preserved collective memory while enforcing moral lessons. Children were warned about witches not out of fear of execution, but to instill social norms and caution. Herbal knowledge, charms, and protective rituals continued, reframed as practical tools rather than supernatural weapons. Communities maintained continuity of practice, transmitting cultural wisdom across generations while avoiding the lethal outcomes of earlier centuries. Late 18th century trials offer insight into the interplay between tradition and rational law. In Germany, local courts occasionally heard cases involving alleged harm caused by women with knowledge of herbs or folk remedies. Magistrates demanded witnesses and documentary evidence before imposing penalties. Punishments were minimal, ranging from fines to temporary confinement. Switzerland experienced comparable cases, emphasizing careful examination of testimony and moderation in sentencing. France, England, and Scotland all illustrate similar patterns. Accusations persisted culturally, but legal systems had adapted to prevent mass violence. The process reflects a gradual separation of belief from legal enforcement. The broader social implications of these final trials are noteworthy. Communities had learned through historical experience the dangers of unchecked suspicion and fear. Oral tradition preserved knowledge of the past, reinforcing caution and moderation. Folk practices, charms, and protective rituals allowed communities to navigate uncertainty without resorting to persecution. The transformation of fear into cultural memory demonstrates how societies adapt to trauma, using narrative, custom, and social practice to maintain cohesion while limiting harm. By the 19th century, witch trials were nearly extinct across Europe. Centralized authority, rational legal procedures, and scientific understanding prevented accusations from escalating into lethal action. Folk belief persisted, but enforcement had shifted entirely from courts to social memory and cultural practice. Communities relied on observation, practical remedies, and moral guidance rather than fear of supernatural retaliation. Witches became symbolic, representing caution, tradition, and historical memory rather than imminent danger. The European witch hunts offer important lessons about social behavior under stress. Fear, amplified by authority, superstition, and social tension, can result in collective harm. Vulnerable individuals are often targeted, with social, economic, and cultural factors influencing who is accused. The decline of witch hunts illustrates the potential for societies to reform, applying reason, oversight, and evidence to prevent violence. Cultural memory and folklore allow communities to retain lessons from the past while avoiding repetition of destructive behavior. Even after prosecutions ended, the legacy of witch hunts influenced European social and cultural development. Oral tradition preserved stories of accused witches, moral lessons, and communal experiences. Literature, art, and folklore continued to depict witches and magical practices, embedding the memory of persecution in cultural consciousness. Communities remembered both the fear and the injustice of earlier centuries, using these memories to guide behavior and promote social cohesion. Historians examining late witch trials note patterns consistent with earlier centuries. Accusations often arose from misfortune, disputes, or social marginalization. The accused were frequently vulnerable individuals, and social and legal mechanisms shaped the outcomes of trials. However, the 18th and early 19th centuries reflect significant shifts: reliance on evidence, moderation of punishment, and skepticism towards supernatural claims. These changes mark the end of the era of fear-driven persecution and the beginning of rational, historically informed social memory. As the 19th century unfolded, the transformation from fear to folklore became more pronounced. Witches were no longer prosecuted. Instead, they were integrated into cultural narratives, stories, and traditions. Communities retained awareness of the consequences of accusation, using stories and oral history to instruct, caution, and entertain. Folk practices and herbal knowledge persisted, reframed as practical guidance rather than magical enforcement. The memory of witch hunts served as a cautionary tale, preserving lessons about fear, justice, and social cohesion. Even as Europe entered modernity, the shadow of witch hunts continued to shape cultural attitudes. Legal reforms, centralized governance, and scientific understanding had curtailed the mechanisms of persecution, but belief in supernatural causation, folk remedies, and moral storytelling remained embedded in daily life. Communities balanced tradition and reason, preserving social norms and cultural identity without repeating the lethal consequences of the past. The European experience demonstrates how societies can reconcile historical trauma with progress, transforming fear into collective wisdom. By studying the final stages of witch hunts, historians gain insight into the long-term dynamics of fear, authority, and social adaptation. The decline of prosecutions illustrates how legal, intellectual, and cultural developments can constrain destructive behaviors, while the persistence of folklore shows how communities retain historical memory and social norms. European witch hunts offer lessons about the interplay of superstition, justice, and communal life, demonstrating the capacity of societies to learn from past mistakes and prevent repetition of harm. The story of the witch hunts, from their peak in the 17th century to their decline in the 18th and early 19th centuries, is a story of both terror and adaptation. Communities once consumed by fear learned to restrain suspicion, courts learned to demand evidence, and intellectual currents encouraged rational analysis of misfortune. Cultural memory preserved lessons, shaped social behavior, and transformed fear into narrative and moral instruction. The legacy of these events continues to inform our understanding of European history, human psychology, and the mechanisms by which societies respond to uncertainty, misfortune, and perceived threat. By the early decades of the 19th century, the legal prosecution of witches had largely disappeared across Europe, yet isolated instances of accusation and trial continued in some rural or culturally conservative regions. These late cases, though rare, provide insight into the persistence of folk belief and the social mechanisms that had once enabled mass persecution. In remote German villages, for example, disputes over inheritance, sudden illness, or livestock death occasionally prompted accusations. Often, the accused were older women living alone, widows, or individuals with little social support, reflecting a historical continuity of vulnerability that had persisted for centuries. Local authorities, however, now approached such cases with greater caution, demanding corroboration and evidence before imposing penalties. In these late trials, the procedures reflected the dramatic evolution of the European legal system. Confessions obtained under coercion were no longer acceptable, and torture, which had been central to 17th-century prosecutions, was almost entirely prohibited. Courts emphasized the reliability of witnesses, examined tangible evidence, and often sought explanations for misfortune rooted in natural causes. Punishments, when applied, were modest fines, temporary imprisonment, public penance, or symbolic acts of social correction. The decline in severity demonstrates the gradual triumph of rational legal practices over superstition and fear. Switzerland illustrates this trend particularly clearly. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, isolated accusations of witchcraft still occurred, frequently related to the sudden death of children or unexplained illness. Magistrates applied strict standards, requiring multiple witnesses and verification of alleged magical acts. Even in these cases, punishments were usually non-lethal, often intended more as reconciliation or moral correction than retribution. These practices highlight the delicate balance between lingering cultural belief and the rationalizing influence of centralized judicial authority. France experienced a similar pattern. In rural provinces, cases occasionally arose in which individuals were accused of causing misfortune through supernatural means. These prosecutions were rare and often localized, generally involving one or two individuals rather than entire communities. Courts required evidence and testimony that could withstand scrutiny, reflecting Enlightenment influence on legal practice. Punishments were typically fines or public penance, and executions were almost non-existent. By this time, the idea that misfortune could be attributed to witchcraft had become increasingly symbolic rather than practical, existing more in social imagination than in enforceable law. England and Scotland had moved even further from legal persecution, though belief in witchcraft remained prevalent in rural areas. Stories of witches, curses, and charms were widespread, passed orally from generation to generation. While accusations occasionally arose, they were generally resolved informally, without recourse to execution or corporal punishment. Folk practices and herbal remedies remained important, serving practical, moral, or social functions rather than representing instruments of legal enforcement. The persistence of such beliefs demonstrates how cultural memory outlasts formal legal action, preserving the social influence of superstition even in the absence of direct threat. Scandinavia, too, saw a decline in prosecutions, with Norway and Denmark having largely eliminated execution for witchcraft by the early 18th century. Late accusations were typically symbolic or mild, emphasizing mediation, community reconciliation, or minor penalties. Execution and severe corporal punishment had effectively disappeared. These regions demonstrate that while cultural belief could persist for centuries, the institutional mechanisms that had enabled lethal persecution could be reformed and ultimately restrained by legal oversight and rational practice. Italy, with its regional diversity, provides insight into the late stages of European witch belief and its interaction with law. In northern regions, influenced by Germanic and Swiss practice, occasional accusations occurred, often related to herbal knowledge or alleged magical harm. Courts were cautious, requiring evidence and testimony, and punishment rarely extended beyond fines or minor social penalties. Southern Italy, where folk tradition and superstition were deeply embedded in daily life, typically handled disputes through informal mediation rather than formal prosecution. The persistence of folk belief in both regions underscores how deeply embedded supernatural explanations were, even when legal enforcement had disappeared. The social consequences of centuries of witch hunts were still evident in communities at this time. Families of the accused were sometimes stigmatized for generations, local relationships were affected by lingering suspicion, and communal memory retained vivid accounts of persecution. These effects were reinforced through oral history, local chronicles, and storytelling. Communities transmitted cautionary tales, using historical memory to shape social behavior and maintain moral and practical norms. Even when the threat of execution had vanished, the stories of witches continued to guide social expectations, teaching lessons about envy, conflict, and the dangers of suspicion. Folklore became the primary vessel for the memory of witch persecution. Stories of witches, magical practices, and their supposed harm shifted from instruments of fear to tools for moral instruction, entertainment, and cultural identity. Children were warned of witches to instill discipline or caution, rather than to prevent legal prosecution. Charms, herbal remedies, and protective rituals persisted, reframed as practical advice or tradition rather than instruments of supernatural protection. Communities retained knowledge of prior social danger while adapting to a world where formal legal action was constrained by reason and evidence. Late trials provide insight into the transitional dynamics of this period. In Germany, some towns continued to prosecute alleged witches for harming children or livestock. Courts demanded credible witnesses and corroborating evidence, and punishments were typically limited to fines or temporary confinement. Switzerland similarly maintained careful oversight, ensuring that accusations could not escalate without substantive proof. France, England, and Scotland also reveal the ongoing tension between cultural belief and rational legal enforcement. Accusations occurred, but they were constrained by legal reform, intellectual scrutiny, and emerging scientific understanding. The decline of witch hunts demonstrates the broader capacity of societies to reform in response to historical trauma. Communities had learned, through centuries of fear and persecution, the dangers of unchecked suspicion and the consequences of rumor. Folk memory preserved these lessons, reinforcing moderation, fairness, and caution. Traditional practices, charms, and herbal knowledge allowed societies to navigate uncertainty without returning to lethal persecution. Cultural adaptation transformed fear into narrative and moral guidance, ensuring continuity of social norms while limiting harm. By the 19th century, witch trials were nearly extinct, though cultural memory remained potent. Folk belief persisted, shaping social practices, moral instruction, and local storytelling. Communities preserved knowledge of past persecution while preventing repetition of its worst consequences. Witches had transitioned from active threats to symbolic figures, representing caution, moral order, and historical memory rather than imminent danger. The transformation of fear into folklore illustrates how societies can integrate traumatic history into culture without perpetuating harm. The long-term effects of witch hunts extended beyond folklore. Legal systems, informed by centuries of experience, developed principles of evidence, fairness, and centralized oversight to prevent recurrence of mass hysteria. Social norms were shaped by collective memory, promoting moderation, caution, and attention to justice. Folk storytelling, literature, and local chronicles preserved lessons from the past, embedding moral and social guidance in culture. European communities, though no longer subject to witch persecution, remained aware of the social consequences of fear and suspicion. Individual cases in this period, though isolated, illustrate the intersection of tradition, superstition, and law. In Germany, accused individuals were often elderly women, widows, or socially marginalized members of the community. Courts required witness testimony and verification, and penalties were usually limited to fines, public penance, or brief confinement. Switzerland, France, England, and Scotland demonstrate comparable patterns. Accusations persisted culturally but were constrained legally. These cases highlight the gradual decline of persecution, the persistence of belief, and the ongoing importance of social memory in shaping behavior. The transformation of European society during this period highlights the adaptive capacity of human communities. Legal and intellectual reforms constrained fear-driven violence, while folk memory preserved social lessons and moral guidance. Communities integrated the historical experience of witch hunts into cultural practices, transforming past trauma into instruction, storytelling, and ritual. Folk practices, charms, and moral tales continued to influence daily life, demonstrating the enduring impact of cultural memory, even in the absence of institutional enforcement. By the early 19th century, Europe had largely transitioned from a continent of fear-driven witch persecution to one in which superstition persisted primarily in folklore, moral storytelling, and cultural practice. Legal systems ensured that accusations could not escalate into lethal consequences. Communities retained awareness of past dangers through oral history, literature, and social instruction, creating a continuity of memory that preserved moral and practical lessons. The shadow of the witch hunts remained, not as active terror, but as a framework for understanding human behavior, social cohesion, and the consequences of fear. Studying the final decades of witch trials offers insight into the long-term dynamics of superstition, social pressure, and institutional reform. Accusations persisted because cultural memory and fear had deep roots, but legal and intellectual developments constrained their impact. Communities learned to navigate misfortune and interpersonal conflict without resorting to execution, while folklore preserved the memory of past terror. European societies adapted, transforming fear into narrative, moral guidance, and cultural practice, demonstrating both resilience and historical consciousness. Even after prosecutions ceased, the cultural legacy of witch hunts influenced literature, art, and social instruction. Tales of witches became central to European storytelling, shaping moral and social norms. Folk practices and herbal remedies remained common, integrated into practical, cultural, and symbolic frameworks. Communities transmitted cautionary stories across generations, teaching lessons about envy, accusation, social cohesion, and the consequences of fear. This transition illustrates how societies can convert traumatic history into cultural memory without perpetuating harm. The European witch hunts, from their peak in the 17th century to their decline in the 18th and early 19th centuries, illustrate a complex interplay between fear, authority, social tension, and cultural belief. They show how communities, when influenced by superstition and institutional power, can inflict profound harm on vulnerable individuals. They also demonstrate the capacity for reform, legal oversight, intellectual critique, and cultural adaptation. Gradually constrained persecution, preserved memory, and promoted moral and social continuity. The enduring memory of these hunts remains relevant today. They serve as historical evidence of the destructive potential of fear when combined with authority, superstition, and social pressure. They also demonstrate the human capacity for reflection, adaptation, and preservation of collective lessons. Communities transformed the memory of persecution into narrative, folklore, and moral instruction, ensuring that the lessons of history would not be lost, while preventing the repetition of deadly practices. The long arc of European witch hunts, from initial fear and persecution to cautious legal reform and eventual cultural memory, underscores the importance of understanding the interplay of social, psychological, and institutional factors. Legal reforms, intellectual critique, and centralized authority prevented the recurrence of mass persecution, while cultural memory preserved social lessons. Communities learned to navigate fear, misfortune, and suspicion through moral guidance, storytelling, and practical knowledge rather than violence. The European experience provides a lens for understanding both human vulnerability and societal adaptation in the face of collective fear. By the middle of the 19th century, the European continent had largely put an end to the legal persecution of alleged witches, yet cultural and social memory continued to shape community life. Even though executions had disappeared and legal prosecutions were rare, belief in supernatural causation endured in many rural and remote areas. Communities retained traditional explanations for misfortune, such as illness, crop failure, or livestock death, often attributing them to witches or malevolent forces in ways that did not invoke formal legal action. In these regions, accusations were frequently linked to personal disputes, jealousy, or long-standing social tensions. Germany provides a particularly clear example of the persistence of folk belief. While the judicial system had fully moved toward evidence-based prosecution, accusations occasionally arose in villages where misfortune occurred. Elderly women, widows, or socially marginalized individuals were most often implicated, echoing patterns from previous centuries. Courts now demanded credible testimony, multiple witnesses, or tangible evidence before imposing any sanction. Even when cases proceeded to judgment, punishments were typically limited to fines, public confession, or brief detention. Execution and corporal punishment had effectively vanished. These late trials illustrate the intersection of enduring cultural memory, social vulnerability, and a rationalizing legal system. Switzerland experienced similar developments. Isolated cases of alleged witchcraft appeared in rural cantons, often tied to sickness, unexplained death, or economic misfortune. Courts exercised restraint, carefully examining testimony, considering alternative explanations, and avoiding coercion. The penalties were generally mild, designed more to restore social harmony than to punish supernatural interference. By this stage, witchcraft accusations had shifted from a legal problem to a social and cultural concern, demonstrating how communities adapted to the legacy of centuries of fear. France had likewise moved away from lethal prosecutions. Rural regions continued to see occasional accusations, often linked to misfortune within families or disputes over property. Courts demanded substantiated evidence, rejected confessions obtained under pressure, and generally imposed non-lethal penalties such as fines or temporary detention. Central authorities, influenced by Enlightenment principles and rational legal reform, ensured that prosecutions were exceptional and measured. By the mid-19th century, the idea of witches as an active legal threat had largely vanished, though their presence persisted in oral tradition and local storytelling. In England and Scotland, prosecutions had ceased decades earlier, but folk belief remained culturally significant. Stories of witches' charms and curses were passed through generations, shaping moral instruction, cautionary tales, and social behavior. These narratives served to explain misfortune, enforce social norms, and maintain communal cohesion. Even in the absence of legal enforcement, belief in witches influenced behavior, guiding daily life, social interactions, and community expectations. Folk remedies and protective rituals were common, blending practical application with symbolic meaning, ensuring the continued presence of supernatural ideas in everyday life. Scandinavia also demonstrates the endurance of belief, alongside the near-total cessation of legal prosecution. Norway and Denmark had largely eliminated execution for witchcraft by the 18th century, and late accusations typically resulted in minor social penalties or symbolic resolution. Folk belief persisted, particularly in remote areas, influencing social behavior, moral expectations, and communal practices. Communities relied on traditional rituals, charms, and storytelling to navigate misfortune and social tension, demonstrating how cultural memory could maintain influence even after institutional authority ceased enforcement. Italy, with its varied regional traditions, offers further insight into this period. Northern Italy, influenced by Germanic and Swiss practice, saw occasional accusations related to herbal knowledge, folk remedies, or interpersonal disputes. Courts exercised caution, requiring evidence, testimony, and careful deliberation before issuing penalties. Punishments were modest, often limited to fines, restitution, or public penance. Southern Italy, where superstition and local custom were more deeply embedded, relied primarily on community mediation to resolve alleged magical offenses. These regional differences illustrate the interaction between local culture, governance, and legal rationality in shaping the handling of residual witchcraft beliefs. The social consequences of centuries of witch persecution remained significant. Communities bore the psychological and cultural legacy of repeated fear, accusation, and social disruption. Families of the accused were sometimes stigmatized across generations. Trust among neighbors had been undermined by past cycles of suspicion, rumor, and conflict. Even in regions where prosecutions had ended, the stories and memories of past witch hunts influenced social norms, communal expectations, and moral instruction. Oral history, local chronicles, and folk storytelling preserved knowledge of past injustice, while guiding contemporary behavior. The transition from fear to folklore represents a central feature of this period. Tales of witches, magical harm, and protective rituals shifted from tools of legal enforcement to cultural memory. Children were cautioned against witches not as a matter of law, but as moral instruction and social guidance. Herbal remedies, charms, and protective rituals continued, reframed as practical knowledge, social custom, or symbolic behavior rather than instruments of supernatural power. Communities retained continuity of practice while adapting to a world in which lethal persecution was no longer sanctioned. Late trials from the 18th and early 19th centuries reveal the mechanics of this transitional phase. In Germany, Switzerland, and France, some local cases involved accusations of harm to children, livestock, or property. Courts carefully evaluated testimony, sought corroborating evidence, and applied mild penalties. England and Scotland relied on informal resolution, local mediation, and moral instruction rather than judicial punishment. Even in the rare legal cases, the courts emphasized rational investigation, social harmony, and the protection of the vulnerable. These examples demonstrate the coexistence of enduring cultural belief and rational legal oversight. The broader social implications of this period reflect lessons learned over centuries. Communities became increasingly aware of the dangers of unverified accusation, the consequences of social conflict, and the importance of moderation. Folk memory preserved these lessons, using narrative, oral tradition, and symbolic rituals to guide behavior. Charms, protective rituals, and moral storytelling allowed communities to navigate misfortune, interpersonal tension, and uncertainty without resorting to violence. This adaptive strategy illustrates how societies can integrate traumatic history into cultural memory while preventing repetition of harm. By the mid-19th century, Europe had largely completed the transition from active prosecution to cultural memory. Legal systems, informed by Enlightenment thought, rational procedure, and centralized oversight, ensured that accusations could not escalate into lethal outcomes. Communities retained awareness of past dangers, embedding lessons from the witch hunts into folklore, moral guidance, and social practice. Witches transformed from real legal threats into symbolic figures, cautionary characters, and objects of cultural storytelling. The long-term effects of witch hunts extended beyond folklore. Legal reforms established principles of evidence, fairness, and centralized authority that prevented mass hysteria. Social norms were shaped by collective memory, promoting moderation, caution, and moral reflection. Oral history, literature, and local chronicles preserved knowledge of persecution, ensuring that communities remembered both the fear and injustice of the past. European societies learned to navigate social tension and misfortune without repeating lethal practices. Individual cases from the late stages of European witch trials illustrate both continuity and change. The accused were often socially marginalized individuals, older women, or widows. Courts required evidence and witness testimony before imposing any penalty. Punishments, when applied, were generally mild fines, public penance, or short-term detention. Switzerland, France, England, and Scotland all provide comparable examples, demonstrating the coexistence of lingering cultural belief with rational legal oversight. These late trials underscore the gradual decline of persecution, the persistence of superstition in daily life, and the central role of social memory in shaping communal behavior. The transformation of European society in this period underscores the adaptability of human communities. Legal reforms and intellectual critique constrained fear-driven violence, while cultural memory preserved lessons and guided moral behavior. Communities integrated traumatic history into folklore, oral tradition, and practical knowledge, converting fear into social guidance. Charms, herbal remedies, and storytelling remained influential, demonstrating the enduring role of cultural memory in navigating uncertainty. By the late 19th century, witch trials had effectively disappeared across Europe. Legal mechanisms ensured that accusations could not escalate into lethal consequences. Folk belief persisted in cultural form, shaping social behavior, moral instruction, and community identity. Witches became symbolic figures embedded in storytelling, art, and literature rather than representing a tangible threat. Communities had successfully transformed historical fear into narrative, moral guidance, and social cohesion, illustrating the capacity of societies to adapt and preserve memory without perpetuating harm. The legacy of witch hunts provides enduring insight into the dynamics of fear, authority, and social adaptation. Accusations were historically driven by superstition, social conflict, and institutional authority, often targeting vulnerable individuals. The decline of persecution reflects the ability of societies to constrain destructive practices through law, intellectual inquiry, and cultural adaptation. Folklore, storytelling, and ritual allowed communities to preserve memory, transmit lessons, and maintain cohesion without repeating the violence of the past. Even into the 20th century, the cultural influence of European witch hunts persisted. Folklore, literature, and local history continued to depict witches, magical practices, and protective rituals. Communities maintained awareness of the consequences of accusation and fear, embedding historical lessons into moral and social instruction. Folk knowledge and symbolic practice persisted alongside scientific understanding, creating a layered cultural memory that combined caution, tradition, and practical guidance. By examining the trajectory of witch hunts, from widespread fear and lethal persecution to isolated trials, legal reform, and cultural memory, historians gain insight into the interplay of superstition, law, and society. The decline of executions demonstrates the effectiveness of legal reform and rational oversight, while the persistence of folklore highlights the enduring influence of cultural memory. European communities learned to navigate uncertainty and misfortune through reasoned legal processes, moral storytelling, and traditional practice, balancing historical knowledge with contemporary social needs. The European witch hunts, spanning several centuries, illustrate both the destructive potential of fear and the capacity for adaptation and reform. Communities experienced cycles of accusation, prosecution, and social disruption, which left lasting scars. Over time, legal, intellectual, and cultural developments transformed these experiences into structured social memory. Folk narratives, charms, and moral stories preserved lessons from the past, while preventing the repetition of harmful practices. The history of witch hunts demonstrates both the fragility and resilience of human societies in the face of fear, uncertainty, and social tension. Throughout the 19th century, remaining accusations of witchcraft in Europe appeared mainly in remote villages or regions with deeply rooted folk traditions. These cases rarely involved formal executions, yet the cultural weight of superstition remained significant. Communities often attributed illness, misfortune, or sudden death to malevolent individuals, usually socially marginalized women or the elderly. Local authorities approached such claims with heightened caution, emphasizing verification, testimony, and mediation. Legal systems no longer allowed arbitrary punishment, reflecting centuries of reform and the influence of rational thought. Germany retained pockets where superstition still shaped communal interaction. In isolated valleys, disputes over property, inheritance, or family conflicts sometimes resulted in charges against a woman perceived as responsible for illness or crop failure. Magistrates examined witnesses carefully, evaluated any tangible evidence, and generally favored symbolic forms of restitution or public penance. Occasional fines were imposed, yet the lethal consequences of earlier centuries had vanished entirely. Even with reduced legal authority, the social influence of witchcraft belief persisted in cautionary tales, family stories, and village memory. Regions within Switzerland exhibited similar patterns. Allegations often involved minor disputes or misfortune affecting livestock and children. Court intervention focused on reconciliation rather than punishment, aiming to restore harmony within communities. Rituals, charms, and local protective practices continued to provide a framework for understanding misfortune. These methods maintained continuity of traditional belief, while ensuring that fear did not escalate into violence. Even in areas with strong legal oversight, villagers integrated folk knowledge into daily life as a means of guidance rather than coercion. France experienced residual cases largely concentrated in rural provinces where local customs and superstition retained influence. Accusations of witchcraft occasionally surfaced after unusual illness or sudden death, often intertwined with social tension or family disputes. Legal authorities scrutinized claims extensively, often dismissing unverified allegations. Minor sanctions occasionally applied, such as public admonition or fines, reflecting the residual cultural belief, while emphasizing rational legal procedure. The transformation from persecution to mediation illustrates the capacity of institutions and communities to coexist with long-standing superstition without reproducing violence. Within England and Scotland, formal trials had largely ceased decades prior. However, stories of witches and magical harm remained prominent within oral tradition and rural culture. Communities preserved these narratives to explain misfortune, teach moral lessons, and reinforce social cohesion. Folk remedies, protective charms, and practical knowledge persisted alongside these narratives, bridging superstition with pragmatic guidance. While legal action had ceased, belief continued to influence behavior, social interaction, and moral instruction. Communities adapted historical fear into cautionary tradition rather than legal enforcement. Scandinavia presents an interesting variation. Norway and Denmark witnessed residual accusations, though these were rarely formalized through courts. Local leaders often mediated conflicts or offered symbolic remedies, ensuring that social tension did not escalate into violence. Folk belief remained strong in rural regions, shaping practices surrounding illness, agriculture, and social conduct. Protective rituals, storytelling, and oral tradition reinforced moral and practical guidance, preserving the memory of witch hunts while avoiding repetition of their lethal consequences. Italy, with its regional diversity, maintained both northern and southern variations. In northern areas influenced by Swiss and Germanic practices, accusations occasionally involved individuals knowledgeable in herbal remedies or folk medicine. Courts examined evidence rigorously, generally imposing minor penalties or requiring restitution. Southern Italy, with stronger local superstition, relied on mediation and community negotiation rather than judicial action. Across the peninsula, these practices reflect a continued cultural engagement with witchcraft beliefs, while demonstrating the restraint imposed by evolving legal and intellectual frameworks. The social impact of witch hunts persisted across generations. Communities carried collective memory of accusations, trials, and punishments. Families of the accused sometimes faced long-term social stigma, and local relationships continued to be shaped by historical awareness of suspicion. Oral tradition, local chronicles, and storytelling served as mechanisms for transmitting knowledge of past events, guiding social behavior, and instilling moral caution. Even where legal enforcement had disappeared, the psychological and cultural influence of witchcraft belief remained evident. Transformation from persecution to folklore emerged as a central cultural phenomenon. Tales of witches, magical harm, and protective rituals shifted from instruments of legal authority to tools of moral education and social guidance. Children learned caution and social values through storytelling rather than through direct threat of punishment. Herbal remedies, charms, and ritual practices continued to hold significance, blending practical utility with cultural symbolism. Communities preserved continuity of traditional knowledge while integrating lessons learned from the violence of earlier centuries. Late trials, though rare, provide insight into the social and legal dynamics of this period. Germany and Switzerland saw accusations primarily centered on illness, death, or damage to property. Courts evaluated evidence, weighed witness testimony, and imposed minor penalties designed to reconcile communities rather than punish suspected witches. France, England, and Scotland demonstrated similar patterns, combining social mediation with legal oversight. These cases illustrate the interplay between lingering cultural belief, social vulnerability, and the rational constraints imposed by law. Long-term social implications reveal the persistence of fear within a framework of moderation. Communities retained cautionary tales, traditional practices, and local rituals, using them to navigate social relations, interpersonal conflict, and misfortune. Historical memory of persecution shaped moral instruction and reinforced social cohesion. Charms, herbal remedies, and folk practices persisted, providing both symbolic and practical guidance. The adaptive use of historical memory highlights the capacity of societies to transform trauma into instructive cultural frameworks. European societies gradually completed the transition from active prosecution to mediated cultural memory. Courts no longer enforced supernatural accusations lethally, and legal systems required rigorous evidence. Communities integrated historical knowledge into storytelling, ritual, and social practice, transforming fear into cultural guidance. Witches became symbolic figures within oral and literary tradition, embodying caution, morality, and historical reflection rather than imminent danger. The enduring cultural legacy of witch hunts manifests in multiple forms. Oral history, folklore, and literature preserved narratives of persecution, moral instruction, and cautionary tales. Communities transmitted knowledge through storytelling, ritual, and symbolic practice, ensuring that historical lessons remained accessible while preventing recurrence of lethal action. Social memory bridged the gap between past trauma and contemporary guidance, allowing communities to maintain cohesion and navigate uncertainty without repeating destructive practices. Even into the 20th century, European folklore retained echoes of witchcraft belief. Literary works, theatrical performances, and local histories continued to explore themes of magic, curses, and witches, preserving cultural memory while shaping moral and social instruction. Folk remedies and charms remained relevant, blending tradition with practical application. Communities navigated social tension, illness, and misfortune using frameworks derived from centuries of experience, demonstrating the adaptability of cultural memory. The trajectory of European witch hunts reveals both human vulnerability and societal resilience. Accusations historically arose from social tension, superstition, and institutional authority, disproportionately affecting marginalized individuals. Over time, legal reform, intellectual critique, and cultural adaptation transformed fear into cultural memory, ensuring social guidance without perpetuating violence. Communities retained lessons about envy, conflict, and suspicion, integrating them into narrative, ritual, and practical knowledge. Historical analysis of late witch trials highlights patterns of social continuity and change. Vulnerable populations continued to be accused, yet legal oversight ensured restraint and fairness. Penalties were symbolic or restorative rather than punitive. Cultural belief remained strong, embedded in oral tradition, ritual, and folklore. This duality, legal rationality alongside enduring superstition, illustrates the complex dynamics by which societies navigate the intersection of fear, authority, and social cohesion. The final stages of witch hunts demonstrate the effectiveness of adaptation. Societies constrained destructive behavior through law, reason, and intellectual discourse, while preserving historical memory through narrative and ritual. Communities retained awareness of past injustices, transmitted moral guidance across generations, and maintained social cohesion through practical and symbolic measures. The transformation from legal prosecution to folklore represents a profound evolution in cultural practice, emphasizing the role of memory, tradition, and moral instruction. European societies preserved the memory of witch hunts across centuries. Oral storytelling, written chronicles, and folk ritual transmitted knowledge of persecution, moral lessons, and social expectations. Witches, once feared agents of harm, became figures within narrative tradition, symbolic warnings, and cultural identity. Charms, herbal remedies, and protective practices persisted alongside moral storytelling, creating layered cultural memory that integrated practical, symbolic, and instructive elements. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe had fully moved away from legal prosecution of witchcraft. Cultural and social memory continued to influence behavior, moral instruction, and community cohesion. Historical awareness of persecution provided cautionary lessons, reinforcing moderation, fairness, and rational judgment. Communities adapted old beliefs into practical and symbolic frameworks, ensuring continuity without lethal consequence. European witch hunts provide lasting lessons in social psychology, law, and cultural adaptation. Fear, when amplified by superstition and authority, caused widespread harm. Vulnerable individuals were often targeted, and social cohesion was disrupted. Over time, reform, rational oversight, and cultural adaptation mitigated these dangers. Historical memory, preserved in storytelling, ritual, and literature, allowed societies to retain knowledge, transmit lessons, and guide behavior without repeating past violence. Even as formal prosecutions disappeared, the cultural influence of witchcraft persisted. Folklore, literary representation, and oral tradition maintained awareness of supernatural belief, moral guidance, and communal norms. Protective rituals and folk remedies provided practical support while reinforcing symbolic lessons. Communities balanced historical memory, superstition, and rational practice, demonstrating resilience and adaptability in navigating social uncertainty. The history of European witch hunts, extending from early accusations through widespread persecution and into final isolated cases, offers a comprehensive study of fear, social pressure, and institutional response. Legal reform, intellectual inquiry, and cultural adaptation constrained destructive behavior, while folklore preserved moral and social lessons. Communities transformed fear into narrative and ritual, ensuring continuity of cultural memory while preventing repetition of historical violence. Understanding the European experience highlights the interaction between social belief, legal authority, and historical memory. Accusations of witchcraft were not merely expressions of superstition, they reflected social tensions, marginalization, and institutional authority. The decline of persecution demonstrates the capacity of societies to reform, and the persistence of folklore illustrates how cultural memory preserves instruction, moral guidance, and communal cohesion. Communities integrated traumatic history into practice, narrative, and ritual, balancing tradition with rational oversight. The trajectory of witch hunts underscores the interplay of human vulnerability, institutional power, and cultural adaptation. Over centuries, communities experienced cycles of accusation, trial, and social disruption. Legal systems evolved to demand evidence, intellectual discourse questioned superstition, and cultural memory preserved lessons for future generations. Folk narratives, charms, and practical knowledge maintained social cohesion and moral instruction while preventing repetition of violence. European society exemplifies both the dangers of fear-driven action and the capacity for historical reflection and adaptation. Even after the 19th century, isolated accusations of witchcraft continued in some of the most remote and traditional regions of Europe. In isolated alpine villages, mountainous valleys, and sparsely populated hamlets, superstition remained part of daily life. Communities continued to interpret illness, sudden deaths, failed harvests, or misfortune as the result of malevolent intervention. Women, often widowed, elderly, or socially marginalized, were still occasionally singled out as responsible for harm, reflecting centuries-old social patterns. Local leaders intervened cautiously, balancing communal tensions, legal precedent, and traditional belief. In most instances, any punishment consisted of public admonition, mediation, or minor restitution rather than imprisonment or execution. Germany retained pockets where local customs preserved the memory of witch hunts vividly. In some villages, elders would recount tales of past accusations as moral instruction for younger generations. Even when accusations arose in the late 18th or early 19th centuries, they were shaped by existing social hierarchies and community memories. Courts required detailed testimonies, evidence, and corroboration. Fines or public penance were typical outcomes, serving as symbols of communal disapproval rather than instruments of lethal enforcement. Such episodes illustrate the tension between cultural memory and rational legal oversight. Switzerland witnessed similar circumstances. Isolated cantons sometimes experienced claims that misfortune had been caused by magical intervention. Local magistrates prioritized evidence-based investigation, yet cultural belief persisted, ensuring that even mild accusations carried social weight. Protective charms, rituals, and communal interventions continued to be used, blending practical concern with cultural tradition. Villagers relied on these customs to navigate uncertainty, restore social harmony, and transmit moral guidance. Folk belief persisted alongside evolving judicial restraint, illustrating a careful adaptation of historical practices. France, particularly rural provinces distant from administrative centers, occasionally saw residual accusations. Individuals, most often women, were blamed for illness, death, or other misfortunes. Legal authorities scrutinized these claims carefully, seeking witnesses, cross-examining testimony, and imposing minor penalties or reconciliatory measures. Executions had disappeared entirely, reflecting the enduring impact of rational legal reform, Enlightenment thought, and societal adaptation. The persistence of folk belief demonstrates the depth of cultural memory even after formal prosecution had been abandoned. In England and Scotland, formal prosecution of witchcraft had ceased decades earlier, but belief in witches persisted in rural culture and oral tradition. Communities continued to recount stories of curses, magical interference, and protective rituals, emphasizing moral instruction, social norms, and cautionary guidance. Folk remedies and charms retained practical utility alongside symbolic meaning. Villagers relied on traditional knowledge to address uncertainty, illness, and misfortune, demonstrating how cultural memory maintained relevance long after legal enforcement had ended. Scandinavian regions retained similar patterns. Norway and Denmark had largely eliminated lethal prosecution, but folk belief persisted in rural communities. Local disputes occasionally resulted in accusations, often resolved through mediation, compensation, or symbolic acts rather than judicial punishment. Rituals, charms, and oral stories guided behavior and social interaction, preserving communal cohesion while honoring long-standing tradition. These practices illustrate the interplay between cultural memory, social norms, and rational oversight. Italy displayed notable regional variation. Northern Italy, influenced by Germanic and Swiss customs, occasionally produced accusations tied to herbal knowledge, local remedies, or interpersonal disputes. Courts emphasized evidence, testimonial reliability, and reconciliation, imposing only minor penalties when necessary. Southern Italy relied more heavily on mediation, communal negotiation, and symbolic forms of redress. In both regions, folk belief persisted, yet legal enforcement reflected centuries of evolution toward restraint, caution, and rational assessment. Communities managed social tension through customary practices rather than punitive measures. Cultural and social memory of witch hunts continue to shape European communities well into the 19th century. Families affected by historical accusations often experienced social stigma for generations. Oral histories, local chronicles, and storytelling transmitted knowledge of past injustices, providing moral lessons and cautionary guidance. Social cohesion was maintained through the careful integration of memory, ritual, and symbolic instruction. Even when courts no longer enforced supernatural claims, the memory of persecution influenced social behavior, communal norms, and moral education. Transformation of witchcraft belief from active threat to cultural narrative became central to European life. Tales of witches, curses, magical harm, and protective rituals transitioned from legal enforcement to moral instruction and social guidance. Children were cautioned through stories rather than judicial threat. Herbal remedies, charms, and symbolic rituals retained relevance, guiding behavior while reinforcing moral lessons. Communities preserved continuity of knowledge while adapting historical fear into culturally acceptable forms. Late trials offer insight into the final mechanisms of social and legal adaptation. In Germany, Switzerland, and France, accusations often involved misfortune or damage to property. Courts emphasized credible evidence, witness verification, and reconciliation. Penalties were symbolic or restorative, rarely punitive. England and Scotland demonstrated similar approaches, resolving accusations through mediation and moral instruction. Even in rare legal cases, rational investigation and social mediation prevailed over fear-driven punishment, illustrating the coexistence of enduring cultural belief and legal constraint. The long-term social effects of witch hunts remained significant. Communities learned the dangers of unverified accusations, social tension, and rumor. Folklore preserved these lessons, embedding them in narrative, ritual, and moral instruction. Charms, herbal remedies, and ritual practices provided both symbolic and practical guidance, allowing communities to navigate misfortune without resorting to violence. Historical memory guided moral behavior, reinforcing social norms and communal cohesion. Across Europe, societies transitioned from active prosecution to mediated cultural memory. Legal systems required evidence, rational procedures, and oversight, preventing lethal enforcement. Communities integrated historical knowledge into storytelling, ritual, and moral instruction. Witches transformed into symbolic figures within oral and literary tradition, embodying moral caution, social guidance, and historical awareness rather than immediate danger. The enduring legacy of witch hunts manifests in folklore, literature, and cultural practice. Oral histories, written chronicles, and folk rituals preserved narratives of persecution, moral lessons, and social expectations. Communities transmitted knowledge across generations, ensuring awareness of historical dangers while fostering moral education and social cohesion. Witches, once active agents of harm, became symbols of caution and morality, reinforcing social order through narrative rather than force. Even into the 20th century, European folklore retained traces of witchcraft belief. Literature, theatre, and local histories explored themes of magic, curses, and witches, maintaining cultural memory while shaping moral instruction. Folk remedies, charms, and symbolic practice persisted, integrating tradition with practical guidance. Communities relied on these inherited frameworks to navigate illness, misfortune, and interpersonal tension, demonstrating the long-term adaptability of cultural memory. The trajectory of European witch hunts illustrates human vulnerability and societal resilience. Accusations historically emerged from superstition, social tension, and institutional authority, often targeting marginalized individuals. Over time, legal reform, rational oversight, and cultural adaptation constrained these behaviors. Communities preserved lessons in folklore, narrative, and ritual, transforming fear into moral and social guidance while preventing repetition of violent persecution. Analysis of late witch trials highlights patterns of both continuity and transformation. Vulnerable populations remained at risk of accusation, yet rational oversight and legal constraints limited consequences. Penalties were generally symbolic, and social mediation replaced violent enforcement. Cultural belief persisted in oral tradition, ritual, and folklore. This duality demonstrates the complex relationship between social fear, legal authority, and cultural memory. The final stages of witch hunts exemplify successful adaptation. Societies constrained destructive practices through law and rational oversight, while preserving historical lessons through storytelling, ritual, and cultural memory. Communities maintained awareness of past injustices, transmitted moral instruction across generations, and fostered cohesion through symbolic and practical frameworks. Transformation from legal prosecution to folklore reflects an evolution in cultural practice, emphasizing historical memory as guidance rather than threat. European communities preserved witch hunt memory across centuries. Oral storytelling, chronicles, and ritual practice maintained awareness of persecution, moral lessons, and social expectations. Witches transitioned from feared agents of harm to symbolic characters within cultural narratives. Charms, herbal remedies, and ritual practice continued to influence daily life, integrating practical knowledge with moral and social instruction. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Europe had fully abandoned legal prosecution for witchcraft. Cultural and social memory continued to shape behavior, moral guidance, and community cohesion. Historical awareness of past persecution provided cautionary instruction, reinforcing moderation and rational judgment. Communities transformed old fears into symbolic and cultural frameworks, ensuring continuity without lethal consequence. The history of European witch hunts offers enduring insight into social psychology, law, and cultural adaptation. Fear, amplified by superstition and authority, produced widespread harm. Vulnerable individuals bore disproportionate consequences, and social cohesion suffered. Over time, legal reform, intellectual discourse, and cultural adaptation mitigated danger. Oral history, folklore, and ritual practice preserved moral and social lessons while constraining destructive behavior. Even after formal prosecutions ceased, witchcraft influenced culture. Folklore, literature, and oral tradition maintained awareness of supernatural belief, moral guidance, and communal norms. Protective rituals and folk remedies persisted, offering both practical utility and symbolic meaning. Communities balanced historical memory, superstition, and rational practice, illustrating resilience and adaptability in navigating social uncertainty. The long arc of witch hunts, from initial accusations to widespread persecution and final isolated cases, provides a comprehensive study of fear, social pressure, and institutional response. Legal reform, intellectual critique, and cultural adaptation constrained destructive behavior while preserving historical memory. Communities transformed fear into narrative, ritual, and moral instruction, ensuring continuity of cultural memory and preventing repetition of historical violence. Understanding the European experience highlights interactions among social belief, institutional authority, and historical memory. Accusations reflected social tensions, marginalization, and authority structures. Decline in persecution demonstrates societal capacity for reform. Folklore preserved instruction, moral guidance, and communal cohesion. Communities integrated trauma into practice, narrative, and ritual, balancing historical knowledge with rational oversight. The trajectory of witch hunts underscores human vulnerability, institutional power, and cultural adaptation. Communities endured cycles of accusation, trial, and social disruption. Legal systems demanded evidence and fairness. Intellectual discourse promoted rationality. Cultural memory preserved lessons for future generations. Folk narratives, charms, and practical knowledge maintained cohesion and guidance while avoiding repetition of violence. European societies exemplify both danger and resilience in response to fear, social tension, and uncertainty. Even as the 19th century progressed, the very last recorded cases of witchcraft accusations appeared in remote regions of Europe, far from urban centers and administrative oversight. In the Baltic territories, isolated villages recounted incidents where women or men were blamed for sudden illness, failed crops, or livestock deaths. In Eastern Europe, similar claims occasionally reached local magistrates, though courts had largely abandoned punitive measures and prioritized reconciliation, mediation, or symbolic acts of restitution. These final episodes illustrate the persistence of cultural belief long after institutional authority had ceased to enforce punishment. Communities navigated misfortune using inherited traditions, rituals, and communal negotiation, blending memory, superstition, and practical guidance. In these closing instances, accused individuals were most often socially vulnerable widows, the elderly, or those living on the margins of society. Courts demanded corroborated evidence, relied on witness testimony, and rejected coercion. Punishments, if any, were symbolic, such as public apology, fines, or ritualized restitution. Executions, torture, and harsh corporal punishment, which had defined earlier centuries, were entirely absent. These cases demonstrate the final stage of Europe's transformation, where fear and superstition persisted culturally, but no longer manifested as lethal persecution. Across the continent, the memory of witch hunts influenced literature, art, and moral instruction. Writers incorporated witches into stories that entertained while conveying social and ethical lessons. Folk tales recounted past injustices, cautioning listeners about envy, suspicion, and conflict. Rituals and charms persisted as cultural practices, often serving practical purposes while maintaining symbolic significance. Communities integrated the lessons of history into everyday life, preserving the memory of past terror while preventing recurrence. From the earliest accusations in the medieval period, through the peak of widespread trials in the 16th and 17th centuries, to the final isolated cases of the 19th century, the story of European witch hunts is one of fear, persecution, and eventual transformation. Millions of individuals suffered under suspicion and legal action, particularly women, the elderly, and socially marginalized members of society. Communities experienced cycles of accusation, trial, and disruption, leaving lasting social and psychological consequences. Legal reform, intellectual scrutiny, and rational oversight gradually curtailed the destructive effects of superstition and institutionalized authority. As prosecutions declined, cultural memory preserved the lessons of these centuries. Folk storytelling, oral tradition, and literature became vehicles for transmitting knowledge, cautionary guidance, and moral instruction. Rituals, charms, and protective practices remained as tangible expressions of these memories. Communities learned to navigate misfortune, social tension, and interpersonal conflict without resorting to lethal punishment. Over time, fear was transformed into narrative, symbolism, and cultural practice, demonstrating resilience and adaptability. By the 20th century, witches existed primarily as figures in folklore, literature, and cultural imagination. Communities retained awareness of historical injustice, moral guidance, and social norms. Legal systems no longer sanctioned punishment, and belief in witches shifted from tangible fear to symbolic caution. The European experience illustrates both the destructive potential of fear and superstition and the capacity for reform, cultural adaptation, and the preservation of collective memory. In summary, the story of European witch hunts spans centuries of human experience. Beginning with suspicion, fear, and isolated accusations, it escalated into widespread persecution and mass trials, causing suffering and social disruption. Over time, rational legal reforms, Enlightenment thought, and centralized oversight curtailed lethal punishment. Communities transformed fear into folklore, oral tradition, and moral storytelling, ensuring that lessons from the past persisted while preventing repetition of violence. Cultural memory preserved knowledge, guided behavior, and allowed societies to balance tradition with reason. Across regions, from Germany, Switzerland, and France to England, Scotland, Scandinavia, and Italy, similar patterns emerged. Belief persisted, persecution waned, and moral instruction endured. The narrative of witch hunts ultimately reveals the interplay of fear, authority, social dynamics, and human resilience. Thank you for watching and joining this calm journey through history. If you enjoyed this storytelling experience, make sure to subscribe for more calming historical narratives. Share this video with anyone who loves history told gently, and leave a comment about which period or event you'd like to explore next. Sleep well, and may the stories of the past guide you safely into dreams tonight.